All right, so today we're going to start sort of a deep dive into a book called Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. And on page 9 of that book, she has a section titled The Man in the Crowd. It's basically the introduction. And she says, quote, "There is a famous black and white photograph from the era of the Third Reich. It is a picture taken in Hamburg, Germany in 1936 of shipyard workers, 100 or more, facing the same direction in the light of the sun. They are hailing in unison, or hiling in unison, I should say, their right arms rigid in outstretched allegiance to the Führer. If you look closely, you can see a man in the upper right who is different from the others." And she goes on to talk about how he's not giving the salute. And she's referring to August Landmesser, a German who, due to personal reasons, became hesitant to acquiesce in what I will simply call Nazi bullshit back in his day. He refused to give the Nazi salute. And if you look at that classic photo, he is standing as close to the people he is with as anyone else, but he still seems distant from them. He had an unlawful relationship with a woman named Irma Eckler, who was Jewish. So, as Wikipedia notes, later he was imprisoned and eventually drafted into penal colonies or penal military service, where he was killed in action. So I'm so used to saying colony instead of military, so that's why I made that little error right there. But it was military service, and he was killed in action. So despite his defiance, he still ended up dying for the Nazi regime. And that's not so surprising because a lot of people died due to Nazism. And in that photo, you can see him staring straight ahead and not saluting. And in a way, that's sort of what a brighter future would look like. Now, to my knowledge, he was not a Jew or black or anything like that. I don't think he was mixed race, but he was not enough of a brown shirt type. And this one act of defiance has been iconic and sort of pinned as one of history's great be that guy moments. So the problem is, though, it can be hard to be that guy when beliefs around you are forced into place by terror. And it's awkward talking about this stuff too because I have to admit I'm a blue eyed, blonde haired white guy. The only sense I would have been a political enemy to the Nazis is that I'm definitely more on the left than on the right, especially compared to somebody like Hitler. And despite all these right wing attempts at historical revisionism, Hitler was actually not a leftist. He objected to communism or Marxism, and he, in fact, emphasized that he viewed them as part of a Jewish plot, so to speak, and even more simply based on policy objectives and stated goals, all the hyper nationalism and emphasis on racial superiority would certainly not blend together with any of the liberals or leftists that I know today. So, trying to debunk that, even though obviously some people are stubbornly rejecting that message. But anyway, I am not Jewish, so I probably would not have been forced to wear anything with a yellow star of David, also known as the Jewish badge, sewn into it. And, I'm not gay or bi, so presumably there would have been no pink triangle symbol for me to wear, which they used to designate homosexuals back in the day, and they would, have them killed as well. And, they had certainly targeted some people who probably did not fit those categories as well. Um, I suppose that's a whole other topic, and I've never really seen anybody address that. People who are falsely accused of, you know, being non-Aryan by the Nazis, but I would assume that had happened. Uh, anyway, talking about myself again, because obviously it's all about me. But anyway, as a matter of fact, at a glance, I think I might have some people say that I look like almost a poster boy for what Hitler might have wanted as far as appearance goes. At least when I was younger and my hair was even more blonde, it's become darker as I've gotten older to the point where it's almost brown now. Whereas as a kid, it was really more of a platinum blonde. But that's actually sort of a trend among blonde-haired people, is that as we age, we tend to get darker hair. Doesn't happen all the time, but it happens a lot. So honestly, I do not know if I would have had the courage that August Landmesser displayed. Then again, some people might take a more tactical view and say it would be reckless and tactless um, to take a direct stand against Nazis when you're in a crowd with them. It could be seen as foolhardy. You could obviously get, hurt or killed or arrested or any number of things. And, this was even more true by the time they became a major cultural force and dominated government and society. So, I'm sorry, I'm kind of running some words together here, but you get my point. What I can say, it is one of the iconic photographs of that era, and apparently authentic, as it was not staged. And other iconic photos from history, like the kiss by the Hotel de Ville from 1950, well, the photographer Robert Desnos actually staged that photo with some models. And this seemed to be more like the real deal, this photo of August Landmesser. And it was sort of a raw moment, apparently totally unmanufactured. It was a genuine experience caught and frozen in time for posterity. The Third Reich, which was, of course, the Nazi party that ran Germany for 4 years and brutally murdered millions of people for the Aryan race, most certainly promoted itself as peaceful and, seeking order and, to have God's chosen people and all that kind of stuff. And frankly, I hear a lot of such talk, around the world today. The Nazi obsession with symbols of identification and power went beyond the Jewish badge, and it all intertwined with an ideology they were developing. As incoherent as their ideology was, adherents still had ways of making sense of it because the propaganda was everywhere. At a certain point, you almost had no choice but to try to make sense of it. And that's one of the lessons of authoritarianism. Nonsensical beliefs can make more sense if you're constantly inundated with symbols and their talking points all day long. It becomes normalized, and maybe even everything ends up geared toward the overarching ideology, the all encompassing, all permeating myth that, you're legally forced to follow at a certain point. And that's another thing, it obviously at first starts as, something you might be able to choose to believe, but by a certain point, there's really no turning back, and you either believe this or you'll suffer some legal consequences. So, in either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, the human being became nothing but the worker, and the worker became the machinery of the state, and all organization was to fall under the umbrella of the state and its ideals. The German waving the Nazi flag was supposed to be the body of the Nazi party, the body of the state, and an expendable body for all of those high ideals. Though I've never watched The Triumph of the Swill or sorry, I just said swill instead of will. Um, but, that's like a Dead Kennedys reference there. It's actually The Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl. I've never seen that, but I do understand its role as a powerful piece of Nazi propaganda. The intense focus on one's own supposed greatness is something that lives on, of course. We hear about plenty of that today. When I was a boy in the 1980s and 90s, the media was intensely America centric and still is to a large degree. Granted, you'd occasionally hear some international headlines, but most coverage of foreign issues dealt with how they would impact people in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that is automatically Nazi like, but it might sort of place an intense focus on one's own, value and worth. And I think that sort of lends itself to authoritarianism. And of course it does, if you really think about it. Also, to prove it's not just an American thing these days, or really ever, you could also consider things like how the BBC has actually been accused of London centrism. So not only can this be applied to nations focusing primarily on themselves, but sometimes the focus might be too intensely centered on only certain parts of a country or a nation, if you will. And then there is the other question. Are we too obsessed with the subject of the Third Reich and Hitler and Nazis? In fact, why isn't there a bit more attention paid to the German post-war era or the history of Germany since 1945? And that's an interesting question. I think, that's often ignored. We want to focus so much on the atrocities and the lead up to the Nazi regime, but I don't think too many people ask, like, how did they move past it? And have they moved past it? And sure, it is important to study the history of the ideology of the Third Reich and understand how, to an overwhelming degree, and for millions of people, it was measured in death and suffering. But there's almost an entire genre of film about the Nazi Germany experience. You get to see the depictions of day to day reality where people starved and lived in concentration camps and ghettos. And really, the History Channel might reasonably be ridiculed for almost being the Hitler Channel because they have so many documentaries on, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Then again, it's not like there are no good movies about these issues or TV shows or what have you. Obviously, Schindler's List is a great movie. Plus, you have underrated movies like Escape from Sobibor, which I definitely recommend checking out. And also, if I object too much about focusing on Hitler and the Nazis, I might sound too much like those people who like to pretend that serial killers aren't fascinating topics, or who think they're overly glorified, and they kind of these people end up patting themselves on the back, acting like great moralists because they're condemning things that are studying serial killers or depicting serial killers or what have you. And that can get a little out of hand too, just in the same way that we can be oversaturated with movies and whatnot about serial killers. I think sometimes people who say that's like immoral or whatever, I think that can get a little out of hand as well. I think the truth is somewhere more in the middle. And the same thing I would say is true with the Nazi stuff or any sort of authoritarian stuff. And I know that some people are out there are like, well, how come more attention isn't paid to Stalin or somebody like that? And you know what? I can kind of agree with that. I think that we should focus on all kinds of different authoritarian regimes and ideologies and, seek to analyze them and debunk them and all that kind of fun stuff. So I can meet those critics halfway. Just like if somebody's family was victimized by a serial killer, I can kind of understand why they would criticize a movie that depicts it. But at the same time, I do think it's a little bit unrealistic to think that, nobody's going to be talking about it in films or literature or anything like that. So, I do think we sometimes need to get to the root of these issues and not just be steeped in them as entertainment, which, let's face it, everything can be to some degree or another. Even our own personal tragedies, which we can draw material from creatively and potentially captivate our audiences with if we're good enough at it and we're artistic. But another interesting thought that's relatively unexplored is how the German school of, let's see if I can pronounce this right, Bildungsbürgertum. I really don't speak German, but anyway, it means the social class that was linked to education and culture. So, how did they end up eventually succumbing to the ideals that ultimately led to the Nazification of Germany? How could that craziness become so normalized? Well, it does remind me a little bit of Britain and the Troubles, which, by the way, is one of the most UK ways to refer to a period of violent conflict with Northern Ireland, just call it the Troubles. But, it does remind me of, you know, uh, all these other events that can really become normalized. So, another example would be the Iraq War, which the American media tried to portray as just being totally normal, and which was largely fed to us through almost laughably ahistorical and incoherent propaganda. For example, it was seldom mentioned that the United States had actually helped prop up Saddam Hussein in the first place. And that was ignored because they knew that, that fact alone might actually endanger some key elements of the entire narrative. Because, if Hitler if Saddam Hussein was indeed such a bad guy and was like Hitler himself, well, then how come we had supported him? You know, that's sort of an entry level question that a lot of people really didn't get a chance to ask because the mainstream media was largely ignoring it. But really, the support for Saddam Hussein actually went back to the JFK administration, as crazy as that sounds. But it's true. Um, yeah. Also, someday, I think we may be able to look back at more of these bizarre events unfolding right now and in recent years, just as a modern audience could watch what life was like for Germans under Hitler's tyrannical regime. Unfortunately, though, sometimes we merely end up retaining the entertainment value, and not enough of us learn those important lessons.